Slavery has been a pervasive institution throughout human history, affecting societies in nearly every part of the world. In the context of Islam, slavery developed within a framework that both absorbed pre-existing practices and introduced new dimensions shaped by religious, cultural, and geopolitical factors. To understand the role of Islam in slavery and how it compares with other forms, such as the transatlantic slave trade, it is essential to trace the origins and evolution of slavery within the Islamic world. Islam's approach to slavery was complex, evolving over time as it spread across diverse regions. The Quran, the primary source of Islamic theology and law, did not outright abolish slavery, but it introduced significant reforms. The Quran emphasized the humane treatment of slaves, the moral encouragement to free them, and placed restrictions on the enslavement of free people, especially Muslims. It recognized slavery as a part of the social fabric, but promoted a gradual emancipation that would maintain social stability. In pre-Islamic Arabia, slavery was widely practiced, often as a result of warfare, debt bondage, or trade. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings sought to regulate slavery within a moral and legal framework that emphasized justice, compassion, and equality before God. Slaves in the Islamic world were given certain rights, such as the right to proper treatment, and many scholars have argued that Islamic law promoted manumission as a virtuous act. However, these reforms did not dismantle the institution of slavery. Rather, they redefined its contours within Islamic society. Islamic law permitted the enslavement of non-Muslims captured during warfare, known as ghanima, war booty. This practice became institutionalized as the Islamic Empire expanded across North Africa, the Middle East, and into parts of Europe and Asia. Slaves were often taken from regions where Islam had not yet been established, including sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. These slaves, unlike their counterparts in the transatlantic slave trade, were not exclusively Africans. The Islamic world enslaved a diverse range of ethnic groups, including Europeans, Persians, and Turks. As Islam spread across these regions, slavery was integrated into the socio-political and economic fabric of Muslim societies. In contrast to the race-based chattel slavery of the transatlantic trade, Islamic slavery was more fluid in terms of race and social mobility. Enslaved people could attain significant social status and even hold positions of power, especially in military contexts. The Mamluk military class in Egypt, for instance, was composed primarily of slaves who were trained as elite soldiers and eventually formed a ruling dynasty. The spread of Islam into sub-Saharan Africa marked the beginning of the Arab slave trade, which would last for over a millennium. Arab traders ventured deep into Africa, establishing trade routes that connected the Islamic world with African kingdoms. Enslaved Africans were transported to various regions within the Islamic Empire, including the Middle East, North Africa, and the Indian Ocean region. The Arab slave trade was more decentralized than the transatlantic slave trade, with many small-scale slave markets operating across different regions. Additionally, slavery in the Islamic world often had a more domestic orientation, with many slaves serving in households, as concubines, or as soldiers. Islamic scholars and jurists throughout history engaged in extensive debates about the morality and legality of slavery. Many scholars emphasize that slavery was an undesirable institution and that freeing slaves was a noble act that would bring spiritual rewards. However, they also maintained that slavery was permissible under certain conditions, as long as it adhered to the ethical principles outlined in Islamic law. This ambivalence allowed slavery to persist for centuries within Islamic societies, despite the moral imperatives of justice and compassion embedded in the faith. Slavery in the Islamic world was characterized by a degree of social mobility that was absent in the transatlantic slave trade. Some enslaved individuals, particularly those who converted to Islam, could gain freedom through various means, including manumission, purchase, or through the completion of military service. The Islamic concept of mukataba allowed slaves to enter into contracts with their masters, whereby they could work to buy their freedom. Additionally, freed slaves could integrate into Islamic society and were often given opportunities to rise in status, particularly if they demonstrated loyalty and competence. Despite these differences, slavery in the Islamic world was still fundamentally an exploitative institution. Enslaved individuals were often subjected to harsh conditions, especially in labor-intensive sectors like agriculture, mining, and military service. The Zanj Rebellion in the 9th century, for instance, was a massive uprising of enslaved Africans in the Abbasid Caliphate who rebelled against their brutal working conditions on sugar plantations in southern Iraq. This rebellion underscores the fact that, despite the legal and religious framework of Islamic slavery, it often resulted in severe exploitation and suffering. The role of women in Islamic slavery also highlights the complexity of the institution. Female slaves were often used as concubines or domestic servants, and their treatment varied greatly depending on the region and period. In some cases, female slaves could gain significant influence, especially if they bore children to their masters. However, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women remained a significant issue throughout Islamic history, raising ethical questions about the alignment of such practices with the teachings of Islam on justice and compassion. As the Islamic world encountered European colonial powers in the 19th century, the institution of slavery came under increasing scrutiny. European colonialists, particularly the British, sought to end the Arab slave trade as part of their broader campaign to abolish slavery globally. This effort was met with resistance from many Muslim rulers, who viewed slavery as a deeply entrenched part of their social and economic systems. The debate over the abolition of slavery within the Islamic world highlighted the tension between traditional practices and the growing global consensus against slavery.